We're going to look at some passages from Century of the Wind today. I sometimes do this in classes that I take something we've looked at early on in the class and I like to look at it again at the end. And of course, Galeano lends himself to that since there's so much that we haven't seen together of his text. You've seen all 3 volumes of the trilogy together. I mean, each of you separately, I know, but together we haven't. So I wanted to go back to the Century of Wind, the 3rd volume of the trilogy, and just look at some of the material that we've seen in other contexts, in other novels, in other, indeed in some slides that we've seen. And so I just picked out a few, and I hope maybe you'll have some suggestions as well. Does anybody have a place or a passage, one of these nice pieces of text, these mosaics, as he refers to them, that you'd like to look at in particular? I mean, not that you should have necessarily, but maybe something caught your eye, or maybe now you haven't reviewed it for a while. But let me go ahead. Anybody dying to talk about some passage or another? Yeah, Eli, dying to. Yay, this is great.
Well, I've just got a question about, he has Hollywood in there like several times. How does he get away with mentioning that? When it was, I thought it was like Latin based.
No, it's all of the Americas.
Everything?
It's pole to pole. So, no, we have passages in the 19th century on Whitman, on Melville, so you've kind of forgotten that he pays great attention, of course, to Latin America, being a Uruguayan, but his intention is an inter-American history. And for me, I love that because my field is comparative literature, as you know, contemporary U.S. and Latin American fiction. And I've gotten more and more into Latin American, but I'm constantly arguing, it's a polemic of mine, that U.S. residents don't know enough even about Mexico, much less about Central and South America, and so we can't think of ourselves as all of America. And so in a funny way, that's his point too. He wants to say that the hemisphere, the Americas, plural, is something that we need to look at altogether. Of course, you know, Eli, we could say he could get away with it easily even from a Latin American perspective, because Hollywood had plenty of entrada, plenty of entree into Latin America, but he's looking at it from a Californian perspective as well. So keep that in mind. In fact, I'm glad you raised that issue because I do want you to think in terms of the entire spectrum, pole to pole, instead of sea to shining sea, as Carlos Fuentes puts it. So think of America pole to pole, North Pole to South Pole, in Galeano terms. He wants us to do that. Other comments or questions about Galeano? Tell me, I asked you when we were doing this the first time in the first 3 weeks of class, how you read this and whether you read it consecutively or whether you just dipped in, and I confess that I tend to open to any page and dip in, and then I'm interested in how things connect, and sometimes I go to the index and I look for everything on a particular writer or a particular historical figure, a particular situation. I did that this time. I wanted to go and look and find particular topics, so I went to the index. Are you all satisfied with your grasp of Galeano? I think maybe it's a book that you never feel like you've grasped, or they're books. Anybody want to comment on that, or should we just let that go? We'll let you all have your own particular relationship to this set of texts. I mean, even we're not used to a trilogy, for one thing, and it's nice that this is chronologically organized, so when we want to look back at the 20th century, we just go to the third book in the trilogy. But I mean, when I look at the 400 or 500 sites in the bibliography, which he's read for one of these volumes, and how he encapsulates so much in these small narrative texts, I'm awed. I don't know. Wow, what scholarship, what creativity, etc. So I hope you are a bit as well. I thought I'd like to go to the Cristero movement. We just saw the novel, Recollections of Things to Come, that has to do with the Cristero Rebellion, as it's called. And you'll remember, of course, that's the 20s in Mexico. Elena Garro gives it to us in novelistic form, of course, but we talked about it plenty. Let's just see, we'll remember some of these things. It's the church's rebellion against the Mexican Revolution, and the people who didn't like the church suppressed. So it's a conservative counter-revolution. Some of you were a little vague on that in your quizzes. It's a conservative counter-revolution. The church has been suppressed by the revolution because it was a negative force in terms of the revolutionaries' view of things. It was too powerful, it was too autocratic, it was anti-democratic. So the Constitution of 1917 takes the property completely from the church. Already the liberal reforms of the 1850s under Benito Juarez had taken away lots of the power of the church. The church just wouldn't give it up. And we've seen the colonial period, and we know how strong the church was, the Catholic Church. And so this Cristero Rebellion is called that. The Cristero refers to the fighters, those who are of Christ. You know, Zapatero, E-R-O, is shoemaker. Zapatero, Zapata is, besides the revolutionary figure, means shoes. So somebody who's an herdo is someone who practices shoes, or who makes shoes, or works on shoes. A cristero is someone who is of Christ. And we're going to see that Galeano picks up on that interesting linguistic turn. Go to 67, will you, in Century of Wind, and we'll just read it. In both cases, he talks about, you see the middle and the bottom entry on page 67, 1927, the plains of Jalisco, and 1927, San Gabriel de Jalisco. Jalisco is the state of Mexico to the northwest of Mexico City. It's north. One of you said southern, which might be a mistake. Ixtepec. There is an Ixtepec in South Mexico, and I don't know why Garro calls her fictional town Ixtepec, but she does. But the Cristero Rebellion was largely in the states of Jalisco, Sonora, and around there. There's another state that's often mentioned, and right now it escapes me, but you may know Guadalajara, the city, you know of it, maybe you've been there, the city that is the capital of the state of Jalisco, the third city of Mexico after Monterrey, and Mexico City, of course, the largest city in Mexico and in the world. So Jalisco, J-A-L-I-S-C-O, you pronounce the J as an H in English. You don't say Jalisco, you say Jalisco. Let's read it. Behind a huge cross of sticks charged the Cristeros, rebelling in Jalisco and other states of Mexico in search of martyrdom and glory. They shout, "Vivas!" for a Christ the King, crowned with jewels instead of thorns, and "Vivas!" for the Pope, who has not resigned himself to the loss of the few clerical privileges still remaining in Mexico. These poor campesinos, farmers, peon, P-E-O-N, might be a accurate English term for campesino, people who live in the campo, people who are countrymen. These poor campesinos have just been dying for a revolution that promised them land. Now, condemned to a living death, they start dying for a church that promises them heaven. Okay, I want to go back to that vivas. Remember that I told you that the Cristeros became called Cristeros because their battle cry when they went into battle, here we see behind a stick sticks made into a cross, they'd yell, "Viva Cristo Rey," long live Christ the King. And so they became then, that's where the Cristero term came from. So they shout vivas. That's a plural. It's been anglicized. You would never say vivas in Spanish. You say they shout viva, viva Cristo Rey. But here they're shouting this phrase various times. So the translator has decided to give it to us in plural, which in Spanish makes no sense. In English, it's kind of an anglicized Spanish if you want. They shout vivas for the Christ the King, and so forth. Now, just go right down to the next one. First of all, let's turn to 279, the parenthetical number, and see his source. It's most likely to be in Spanish, Ela. 297, I don't know what I said. Did I say that? Jean Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R. I mentioned that to a couple of you who thought you might be interested in writing on the Cristero Rebellion and writing on Elena Garro. I bet some of Jean Meyer, he's a man, he's a Frenchman who's lived in Mexico forever and ever, and he is the great expert on the Cristero Rebellion, La Cristiada, as he calls it in his title, which is an interesting sort of the epic of Christ, really. Ada at the end would suggest epic, as in Iliada, the Iliad. In any case, Jean Meyer, unfortunately, those of you who don't have Spanish won't be able to look into that, but I assure you there'll be something on the final about the Cristero Rebellion, so do sort of think about that as you're reviewing your notes on Elena Garro. Let's go on then to the next page, and we'll see, does he use Jean Meyer? Nope, he's got two more. We'll look at those in a minute. The mother covers his eyes. Sorry, the title is A Child Looks On. The mother covers his eyes so he cannot see his grandfather hanging by the feet. And then the mother's hands prevent his seeing his father's body riddled by the bandits' bullets, or his uncles twisting in the wind over there on the telegraph posts. Now the mother too has died, or perhaps is just tired of defending her child's eyes. Sitting on the stone fence that snakes over the slopes, Juan Rulfo, this is a real live person, we've talked about him, and I'll remind you, this is the child. Juan Rulfo contemplates his harsh land with a naked eye. He sees horsemen, federal police or cristeros, it makes no difference. The government troops, that would be like General Rosas, or the townspeople, the campesinos, the country people. He says he sees horsemen. He doesn't distinguish. He's a child, what are we told, 9 years old. He sees horsemen emerging from smoke, and behind them in the distance a fire. He sees bodies hanging in a row, nothing now but ragged clothing emptied by the vultures. He sees a procession of women dressed in black. Keep turning. Juan Rulfo, a child of 9, is surrounded by ghosts who look like him. Here, there's nothing alive. The only voices, those of howling coyotes, the only air, the black wind that rises in gusts from the plains of Jalisco, where the survivors are only dead people pretending. This refers to Elena Garro as well as to Juan Rulfo. Remember I told you about a novel called Pedro Paramo, P-A-R-A-M-O, with an accent on the first A. It's also a book of the dead, just like Elena Garro's Recollections of Things to Come. It's narrated, Pedro Paramo, the novel, by Juan Rulfo, which is probably, if you ask someone in Mexico, anyone practically, what the most famous novel of the 20th century in Mexico is, they'll say Pedro Paramo. It's wildly loved. It's like that. It's a teeny low novel. It's beautiful. Please read it. You'll find it very consonant with Recollections of Things to Come, because it's also told, the story is about a town that's dead. The voices echo, and there's these underground scenes where there's a narrator who's the son of this man called Pedro Paramo. And at first you think he's alive. He's going back to find this town, and then you realize eventually that either he's died. It's hard to locate who's living and who's not. And I love that about Galeano. He gets it perfectly about the novel. Why wouldn't he? He's a genius. But this idea that you can't really distinguish between the living and the dead in this kind of territory, a territory where there are corpses hanging, including his own family's corpses, hanging from trees and from telephone poles. So, and notice it's Jalisco that he lived. He was young during the Cristero Rebellion and wrote the novel Pedro Páramo. It was published in 1955 in Spanish, much later, reflecting this land of well, this disaster, which was the Cristero Rebellion in this part of Mexico. So they say, well, one more time, bad news. One more time, it's a story of disaster, a story of death, a story of bad government, to put it mildly, and so that's what we see there. So I want now, the first time you read this book, which was our third week of class or fourth, if you happened upon this or if you noticed these passages, they wouldn't have meant as much to you, I don't suppose, as they now do with their resonance with the novel that you've all read. So I think going back to Galeano makes sense at this point, and of course we'll barely scratch the surface, but anyway, that's Cristero Rebellion. Any comments or questions, observations about all of this? Do make a point to read Juan Rulfo. I've made a point to myself to assign that novel with Garro the next time I teach this class, if I do, and I may not, who knows, but the two pair very nicely. Is anybody writing on Garro? Yeah. Have you taken a look at Pedro Páramo, Eli? Have you read that book? Pick it up. I think it would enrich your reading of Garro. Yeah, I know it would. And Garro certainly knew about Pedro Páramo. Remember, the Garro novel comes out about 10 years later, well, 8 to be exact. I believe it's 1963, Garro. I don't have my book, but someplace in there, so she would have read Pedro Páramo. What was interesting about Juan Rulfo is he only wrote that novel. He wrote a collection, at least he wrote a lot of things. He was a great photographer, and on our web papers, you'll see that Lisa Broussard, who's not here today because she's taking care of her 3 sons under the age of 6, a lot of kids. She's got a web paper on on Juan Rulfo's photography, and you'll get a sense of that kind of wasteland, black and white, beautiful pictures. Rulfo was a photographer as well as a writer, but he only really wrote during his lifetime, or published, let me say, one collection of short stories called El Llano en Llamas, the Fire on the Plain. It's translated into English, The Plain in Flames. Well, it's El Llano en Llamas. That's literally, what is it called? The Burning Plain. That's how it's translated in English, also by University of Texas Press. Beautiful stories about this kind of landscape where you feel it's like South Dakota during the Dust Bowl. We also have our analogs in North America. Okay, so you'll see, and I'll ask you to look at all of the web papers for the final, so you'll see Lisa's beautiful site on Juan Rulfo's photographs. Okay, but all this is to illuminate Elena Garro, not Juan Rulfo. And I want to go next to a passage on the Amazon, which I hope will resonate for you with The Storyteller, with Vargas Llosa. That's on page 222. It's entitled 1975, Amazon River. This is the father of all rivers. Again, Galeano, this is a great work of protest. I mean, it's not about all the great, I mean, there are certainly positive aspects of Latin American and North American reality that are recorded in this book, but there aren't as many positive as negative. And this is about the destruction of the Amazon. We saw it in The Storyteller, the peoples of the Amazon, indigenous peoples, and also, of course, the resources. We saw the missionaries, all of the discussion, as we recall, in The Storyteller of the various dangers of Western civilization for non-Western or indigenous groups. The worst of which was, it seems to me, the oil companies, university faculty can sit around and debate how best to approach indigenous peoples, whether the socialist model, whether the purist model, remember Saul's idea, leave them alone, etc., whether trying to raise their standards of living. But once the oil companies or business interests come in, all the rest looks pale by comparison, and that's what Galeano is pointing to here. 1975 Amazon River. This is the father of all rivers, mightiest river in the world, and the jungle sprouting from its breadth is the last lung of this planet. The Amazon is called the lungs of the globe by people who refer to the Amazon. A huge rainforest, and it's being deforested. That's the point. The adventurous and the avaricious have flocked to Amazonia since the first Europeans who came this way discovered Indians with reversed feet who walked backward instead of forward over these lands, promising prodigious fortunes. Now, you just know that Galeano got that description of an Amazonian indigenous person from some conqueror's or explorer's description. It's very typical in the early days of exploration that there would be all sorts of fantastic things described. So here, this Indians with reversed feet, you can be almost positive it's one of those 4 numbers down below. In fact, I am positive it is. A silly description of these radical others by a European explorer. Since then, so where we got this first paragraph is the early days of exploration. So ever since then, the adventurous and the avaricious, a nice phrase, avaricious, greedy. Then we go to more recent times. Since then, all business in Amazonia starts with a massacre. At an air-conditioned desk in Sao Paulo or New York, a corporate executive signs a check which amounts to an extermination order. For the initial job of clearing the jungle begins with Indians and other wild beasts. Begins with getting rid of them first. They give the Indians sugar or salt mixed with rat poison, or bomb them from the air, or hang them by the feet to bleed to death without bothering to skin them, because who would buy the hides? Horrible. The job is finished off by Dow Chemicals' defoliants, which devastated Vietnam's forests and now Brazil's. Blind tortoises stumble about where trees used to be. Well, it's a very sobering account. Let's go to the numbers. 55, I should have done this beforehand just to see what's there, but I hope this all inspires you to learn Spanish. 55, yeah, it's, oh, well, no, it's in Spanish. I expect they all are 65. No, 65 is in English. If you look at your bibliography, The Last Frontier, Fighting Over Land in the Amazon. There's plenty of studies been done, and certainly more since 1975, about the devastation of the rainforests in the Amazon area in Brazil, and of course in Peru as well. That's what the storyteller was about. We saw the oil companies begin that process. Yeah, Julie?
I was listening to NPR the other day, and they were speaking about how the soy companies are...
Which companies, sorry?
The soy companies that plant soybeans.
Oh, soy, okay, sorry.
That is, I guess the story that they were focusing on was these soybean corporations that were contributing and cutting down the Amazon to grow soy, and it ruins the soil, it strips the soil of all the nutrients, so it really can't be used again for a long time. And that's really ironic, because most people that eat soy products would not want to be eating soy products from the Amazon. I'm surprised that soybeans grow in the Amazon area, because it's a huge crop in the center of the U.S., in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas. In fact, in Iowa, soybeans are rotated every year with corn. First one year corn, then the next year soybeans. It must be a variant type, it must be another kind of soybean, because that kind of climate is so different from the northern although what do I know for sure? I have been, in fact, in the Amazon, but it seems to me very different. So I'm just very interested that it's soy. What usually has been done is it's deforested, as they point out, for the forest, for the wood, and then for development. I can tell you my Amazon River story if we have extra time. I don't want to get into that, but the fact of the matter is the rainforests all over the world, and the Amazon in particular, are not protected because people cut the wood either for commercial or for their own use as for firewood and so forth. So yeah, interesting. Well, I'm glad NPR is on it. That makes me happy. Okay, so I just thought I would. We could continue on. If we wanted, there is another Amazonian, and we might actually, in fact, I have it marked. Okay, so we have, your site 65 is in English. If you are interested, you can pursue that. Let's just continue looking here. Site in the bibliography 67 is in Portuguese, and 375 also Portuguese, by a very famous cultural historian, Darcy Ribeiro. Let's look at this one. Again, I mean, you may get tired of such depressing news. He pulls absolutely no punches, as we know, Galeano, when it comes to the horrible treatment of indigenous populations everywhere, in North America certainly, as well as in South, but here, this idea of extermination or genocide, really, of indigenous peoples for commercial reasons. And here we get a more political one. It's also in Brazil. It's also in the Amazon. Let's look at it. A Day of Justice, and you'll see there's another Day of Justice down below. That's in Peru, and we're going to stop with this first one. But look at it. Largest countries are the lands of the cattle companies, conquerors of Amazonia. See, that's also the grazing of cattle in these areas. The Brazilian generals exempt them from taxes, open up roads for them, give them credits and permission to kill. The companies use tattered campesinos from the northeast, transplanted here by rivers and poverty. The campesinos kill Indians. Campesino, remember, land worker, farmer, peon in the sense of attached to the land. Campesinos kill Indians and are killed in turn. They steal the Indians' land and are stolen from in turn. They drive off the Indians' cattle whose flesh they will never taste. When the highway reaches the village of Ribeiro Bonito, the police begin the expulsion. Campesinos who resist are persuaded in jail. That's that irony again. You'll see what persuaded means. Pulverizing them with clubs or sticking needles under their fingernails prove useful techniques. The priest João Bosco Bernier arrives in the village, enters the jail, asks for the torturers. A cop replies by blowing his head off with a bullet. The next day, furious women, Carmencina, Naide, Margarida, erect an enormous cross. Behind them, 600 campesinos brandish axes, picks, sticks. The whole village joins the attack, singing in chorus a magnificent voice of voices. And now where the jail stood, a small pile of rubble remains. So this Day of Justice, the people say, no, we're not going to allow this, but you know it's like a straw in the wind in terms of resisting the domestication, the development of the Amazon at the cost not only of Indians, but of these campesinos as well. So anyway, there you have it, rather depressing look, but I hope, complementary to The Storyteller by Vargas Llosa. Progress, this is progress, you see. Okay, I'd also like to look back to Garcia Marquez. I think we did this when we went through the first time, but look at page 74, 75, if you will, 74. Well, no, let's look at 75. All of this is in the area, 1928. Each of these, as you see, is in all four of the pieces on this These 2 pages are in Colombia, 2 in Aracataca, which if you know Garcia Marquez at all, you know that's the little old town on the Colombian coast where he was born. We've mentioned it before. And we know Ciénaga, also, 1928, the bottom left of these 2 pages. Ciénaga del Mar, as it's called, is where the Banana Company massacre occurred, United Fruit, that is dramatized famously in 100 Years of Solitude. But so here, all of these, and 1928 is the year that Garcia Marquez was born. So it's perfect that Garcia Marquez memorializes the workers who struck against United Fruit in 1928 in Ciénaga, against the banana hurricane, a banana storm, as he calls it in the novel. Garcia Marquez, that the baby is born who will immortalize the loss of striking workers who were all machine gunned, and that was that. And it's not known how many. Garcia Marquez in his novel says 3,000. It was officially ignored, so there weren't records kept. And Garcia Marquez later laughed that he reads now that 3,000 is the number because it's taken that he knew the fact he didn't. But he's become the historian. It sort of proves our point about novelists as historians in Latin America. It's his number that has been taken up as the actual factual number. He said he made it up. Look at the top. Just we'll look at this. It kind of reminds us. It's a bit what Galeano does here. What he did for Juan Rulfo. He doesn't mention Elena Garro, but he mentions Juan Rulfo. He's doing the same for Garcia Marquez in 2 paragraphs, summarizing the spirit of this novelist's contribution. Look, we've seen the carnage in Ciénaga. We're not going to read it. Bottom of 74. Go to top of 75. The roundup is on for the wounded and hiding strikers. They are hunted like rabbits with broadsides from a moving train, and in the stations netted like fish. 120 are captured in Aracataca in a single night. The soldiers awaken the priest and grab the key to the cemetery. Trembling in his underwear, the priest listens as the shootings begin. Not far away, a little boy bawls in his crib. The years will pass, and this child will reveal to the world the secrets of a region so attacked by the plague of forgetfulness that it lost the name of things. A scene in the beginning of 100 Years of Solitude, a plague of forgetfulness. He will discover the documents that tell how the workers were shot in the plaza and how Big Mama is the owner of lives and haciendas and of the rain that has fallen and will fall. And how between rain and rain, Remedios the beauty goes to heaven, and in the air passes a little old plucked angel who is falling into a hen house. All references to details, events in the obra, in the work of Garcia Marquez. So I wanted to do that, and then I want to go, did we see the text that is given all in italics from Garcia Marquez's Nobel Prize speech? It seems like we did. Go there real quick one more time. We won't read it all. I just want to point it out to you, and you'll have it in your notes. It's page 262. 1982, Garcia Marquez was given the Nobel Prize. 82, he's still alive. He's not that well. 1928 to almost 2008, you can do the math. He's getting up there. But in 82, really very early in his career, if you consider that in 1967, 100 Years of Solitude was published in English, it took till 1970 to get it, sorry, in Spanish, and translated in 1970 into English. It's really on the basis of that one novel. There was one after that, The Autumn of the Patriarch, but it's on the basis of this one novel. And if you haven't read 100 Years of Solitude, please do. I know many of you have. We've read 2 of Garcia Marquez's novels, but not the most famous. The most famous is clearly, oh yes, and there's the movie now of A Love in the Time of Cholera. But his most famous is 100 Years of Solitude. The second most is his Love in the Time of Cholera, which got a super pan in the New York Times. I don't know if you've seen it. makes me sad, but they basically say that it's, the plot is there, but all the magic and all of the beautiful texture of the language isn't there. Well, yeah, novels aren't movies, but apparently at least the reviewer in the New York Times lamented that a Latin American director hadn't directed. I think he's British, the director. I can't remember quite yet. But he said they just missed the spirit altogether of it. So anyway, read the novel, Love in the Time of Cholera. But before that, read 100 Years of Solitude if you haven't. I'm just going to, you see, it's 262, 263, it's all italics, meaning that it's come straight out of the text. It's the language of Garcia Marquez when he gives his Nobel Prize speech in Stockholm. It's not referred to here. He starts out by saying that he's wearing a guayabera. You know, that the shirt that Mexican men, and I should say Central American men, wear. It's not a necktie with a collar like that. It's a kind of square thing that you wear outside your pants. Well, if you know a guayabera, it usually has ribbing down each side. He wore his guayabera in Stockholm in December to make the point he's making here, that Latin America isn't Europe. And so I won't go through it again since we've already gone through it, but I'll expect you to know this fairly well, again, for the exam. I keep mentioning this because I'm making up the exam mentally these days. Okay, one more, and this takes us to the codices, to the painted books that we saw last time, and I would have expected to find those in the first volume. They're probably there too. In fact, we know they're there because we saw the scene in Mani in Mexico where Diego de Landa is burning the codices of the Maya. But he mentions it here too. Look at page 226. Is that right? 226, yeah. In fact, go to 225. We have a little cluster here of pieces of the mosaic that aren't titled, starting on the bottom of 225. And before I had said that usually, in fact, I think I'd said always, I didn't say always, but I said, well, the ones that are untitled tend to be mythic. They tend to be myths. So they may be indigenous stories. There are lots of them at the very beginning of the first volume, Genesis. And then we see them here or there. Sometimes it's the words of a wise person, like we have one that's untitled, which is from a text by Simón Rodríguez, the teacher of Simón Bolívar. But here I realized that it wasn't altogether complete because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, not untitled, but undated and unplaced pieces about artesania, which means handicraft. But artesanía is a nicer word in Spanish because it's so much like art, arte. So it's about the different forms of art that are made by craftsmen, or different forms of handicraft, if you want. Look, there's one about bark paper, and that's on the top of 226, and I brought some of the kinds of things. Last time I brought some of my facsimiles, but I'll hold some of this up and then I'll pass them around. The bark paper, which has all sorts of scenes. Here's a wedding scene. This one's so messed up. In part, you'll see because it's patched on the back. Remember that we looked at the ways in which it's made by stringing fiber, both warp and woof, and then pounding it, and this has been repaired because there were holes in it. But I think you'll find the painting very, very, here's the church, the wedding, here are women going to the well, here are other things going on, a corral, a guy bringing a horse. It's meant to be the whole village life. And in fact, I told you that now you can buy these, obviously, for tourists, put on your wall. In fact, the stickum is still on the back of this one. It was on my office wall for quite a while. You can also buy the paper blank, not painted on. I brought a piece of that. People use it for whatever they're going to use it for. I don't know. I buy it because I love bark paper, and I think it's very beautiful with the textures and so forth. But let's see, Lexi, if you could just come and get these and pass them around maybe. I brought another one if you want to start that over. Cody, you want to come and get this one and you can take a look at the different styles. The one that Galeano mentions is the kind that I don't have because I don't like it, which is the very color for birds. I go like this because they often have feathered tails that go out and around and so forth. But let's look at it. The bark paintings of the Balsas River. Before the rains, in the season of the new moon, they strip off the bark of the amate tree. Now remember, we saw a mural by Diego Rivera stripping the bark off of an amate tree. Look back at last Thursday's lecture if you don't remember, because this is how it's done. It's the bark. They stripped trees, the stripped trees die. There is that also. It's very hard on the trees. On its skin, the Mexican Indians of the Balsas River region paint flowers and fantasies, radiant mountain birds and monsters lying in wait, or they paint the daily round of events. That's the kind I'm passing around now. The daily round of events in communities which greet the Virgin in devout procession and summon the rain in secret ceremonies. Before the European conquest, other Indians had painted on amate bark the codices that told of people's lives and of the stars. Remember, I told you about the astrological or astronomical, depending on how you look at it, wisdom that's encoded in the codices that we saw slides of last time. When the conquistadors imposed their paper and their images, amates disappeared. For more than 4 centuries, no one in the land of Mexico painted on this forbidden paper. Not long ago, in the middle of our century, amates returned. All the people are painters, everyone. Ancient life breathes through these amates, which come from afar, from so very far away, but never arrive tired. So it's a very nice homage to the contemporary artesania, handicraft, folk art, that is this kind of use of the amate bark and amate painting. So I just wanted, that kind of brings back this idea. Yeah, Julie?
I didn't mean to interrupt. I just had a question.
I'm sorry.
Where he says, not long ago in the middle of our century, amates returned, all the people are painters, everyone. Do you think he's making a subtle reference to how artesania, which was, as in the forms of the codices, was a traditional, a cultural thing, and now the artesania is like for exploitation and for selling in the markets, and it's just for selling the goods, not for what it symbolizes.
Yeah. Well, I think he's celebrating its return. First of all, don't forget that we saw post-conquest codices. So it wasn't instantly that amate paper and its was forbidden. But he says, and I don't know, I went to see 57, I'm going to try to get the book, on put out by the Museo de Culturas Populares, a museum of popular culture in Mexico City, on amate paper. I didn't know it was forbidden, but it doesn't surprise me in a sense, because once the European paper is imported, people have an interest in using it. So it's one more imposition that would also be for commercial. I don't think he's lamenting that it comes back just for commercial reasons. And in fact, I brought one more thing. Hang on. The amate paper is still used for ceremonial purposes as well. I brought a little god figure. It's got writing on the back, but I don't know if you can see it, but it's a little figure that looks somewhat like the codices. Lexi, can I ask you to come and get this? And I didn't bring with me, but a book that has been made as if it were a contemporary codex. So for the communities, I think the paper still, as in Japan, paper, you go to the shrines and there'll be paper that is sacred. And so we don't have that tradition, but if you look also at the stelae from Maya sites, there are sometimes the royalty will be there doing terrible things to themselves because their blood was important, the blood of kings. That's what the name of the Linda Shealy book. And you will see paper burning, even sculpted in stone. So the paper was sacred, let's say, much less so now. It's mainly in markets for commercial reasons, but I don't see him lamenting that. I think he says it arrives from very, very far, but they never arrive tired. So, yeah.
It just made me think of that because the passage on the opposite page, the little devils of Okumicho.
Yeah.
Or, let's see. No, actually, no, the one below it, on private property and the right of creation.
Uh-huh.
That kind of is about how buyers want the Okumicho potters to sign their works, so they use stamps to engrave their names, as, you know, a kind of romanticized thing, you know, everybody loves trinkets from Mexico where it says like Juan Diego on the bottom, but that this idea of solitary glory isn't a part of their culture.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so again, what he's celebrating, I think, here is the communal sense of creation. That it's not, you know, mine's better than my neighbor's, and therefore I'm going to sign it, and I hope I'll get a higher price. So I think he's looking at things other, you know, it's such a hard question, you know. You see in Mexico this incredible talent of weavers, of potters, I mean, the beautiful pottery and so forth. And you say, well, you know, it's being driven by what the market will buy. I still regret when I went to a town where they still make amate, not buying this little huipil that had in beads here a little thing like for a child like that said Pepsi on it. And I you know, very self-conscious. I think people are taking this modern icon and they think that someone will laugh at that and buy it, and I laughed at it and didn't buy it, and I still regret it because it shows somehow that these arts aren't static. And what's impelling them? What's impelling them is the market. Well, is that too bad? From my point of view, not really, because otherwise the arts would maybe not die, but they wouldn't be as lively as they are. Plus so I may be retrograde in this. I'm not the Saul Mascarita fellow that says just let these people have their own arts and let them, you know, live their own lives. No, I just think culture is more complicated than that. So that if there's going to be a market, there's going to be change, and the change in the art may not be what we want because it will be different from the original. So it's an interesting question you raise, but I don't see him critiquing this as for commercialism. I see him celebrating the artesanos, the workmen who have maintained century after century the artistry. The place where it becomes specific to all of these issues between the difference between high and low art and whether we should make a distinction is on page 225. And if you want to turn back there, it might be worth looking at. The altarpieces of Huamanga. I have one of these at home. I don't know if it's from Huamanga, but in Peru, there are these little boxes like this that will have religious figures, sometimes a religious procession, and they're separate little figures. So think of it like a nativity scene, but it'll be in a box, and you open the doors of the box, and it's all quite complicated. And you buy them in the markets and so forth, and that's what this is about, these altarpieces of Huamanga. In Lima, painters and scholars are indignant. Even the avant-garde registers shock. The National Art Prize has been given to Joaquin Lopez Antay, altarpiece maker of Huamanga. A scandal. Artisanship is okay, say the Peruvian artists, as long as it knows its place. So you see that artisanship would be, I'm sure, a translation from artesanía. I think maybe the better translation would be craftsmanship. But anyway, the altarpieces of Huamanga, first created as portable altars, have been changing their cast of characters with the passage of time. Saints and apostles have given way to sheep suckling their lambs with the condor watching over the world, laborers and shepherds, punitive bosses, hat makers in their workshops, and singers mournfully caressing their charangos, their guitars. Lopez Antay, intruder into art heaven, learned from his Indian grandmother how to make altarpieces. More than half a century ago, she taught him to do saints, and now she watches him at work from the peace of her grave. So the evolution over time of this particular art form and the scandal that was raised when an art prize was given to a village worker who learned the craft from his grandmother. So, well, that was less my point than the point about the art without titles, put it that way. Art without titles, art without signatures, community art that gets passed down from generation to generation, and among them the bark paper that recalls the tradition, the indigenous tradition of the painted books. Okay, I wanted to go to one more place. Anybody want to say anything? I'm just doing all the talking. Yeah, Julie?
What page was the passage that you just read on?
That's 225, just the page before. He sets it up, look how he does it. You know, he sets it up 1975 Lima. I'm sorry I wasn't clear about that. 1975 Lima, he sets up a particular event where the high artists, those trained, let's say, question whether a craftsman, and here we're talking about social classes, we're talking about education, we're talking about huge cultural differences. It's not just that you didn't go to art school, well, Grandma Moses or whatever in our own tradition. It's not just that he didn't go to art school. It's also that he's a villager. So that there's a social and cultural distinction being made here. And then he goes to those 5 passages, which I love, on without the dates, without the places, that suggest the timelessness of these artesanías, of these handicrafts, of these folk art forms. And he's celebrating the communal. I mean, as I say about myth all the time, these are kind of mythic objects, if you want. As I say about myth, my favorite definition is myths are stories that communities tell each other in order to know who they are, right? So it's a shared value system, in this case, a shared art form. And that's when the specific place and specific date gets dropped. Yeah.
How would you, to me, that definition of myth, which I like it, and I agree with it, but how would you differentiate that from religion?
I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, we can if we want, because let's say we could talk about degree maybe rather than kind. In other words, we could say the narrative of Christ, for example, or we could use the narrative of Abraham, let's say, has a kind of truth claim that may be larger than the myth of George Washington cutting down the cherry tree and then not telling his father, and how, you know, our founding fathers were men of great integrity. You see, that's the truth value of that, or the truth claim of that story. So maybe, I mean, I think it's a very good question. I think from my point of view, I like the idea that let's say the Christian narrative, the story of Christ's life and the impact of Christ's life upon believers, that strikes me as a story that Christians, let's not say tell each other, let's say that this story that they share in order to know who they are. So it strikes me that the definition applies, but still we're not going to say that all myths have the same importance for those who hold them. This is, you know, myths are forms of attention, as I call them. They encode their truth value. Let's say, how do I do this? Their truth value has to do with their readers or listeners' investment in them. So, you know, you can tell me, let's say, a myth about a culture to which I don't belong, and I'll say, oh, that's kind of interesting, how clever. Whereas someone who belongs to that belief system will say, oh my gosh, that's about God, or that's about, you know, a tree that speaks, or whatever. So myths are invested, myths are stories that are invested with importance by those who are their listeners or their readers or their tellers. I mean, it's what the storyteller is all about, finally. Vargas Llosa's novel. So, comments or questions on all of that? What's so interesting about things, about the world, I find, is how different we all are one from another, and yet how the same. I mean, the myths may change a great deal, but human beings want stories that tell stories. They want narratives. We want things in which we can invest importance. So what do I invest importance in? Well, Galeano, for example. I thought, wow, this is great. So we all have our hierarchies of value. So I think your question is answered, I think, Julie, by saying there are hierarchies of value. And it depends on, you know, one man's myth is another man's, yeah, trifle. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, other comments or questions? Alrighty. I thought we would go, or you may get sick of going these places. We've also seen Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo since last we saw Galeano, and I thought I would look at the Frida passage. Did we look at that last time, Frida? I think I was predicting, and now I'm looking back. Go here to 77, will you? We won't read it, but let's remember. We've seen pictures of her. I've shown you slides since we read this. Make a note of page 77, will you? And then Diego Rivera, would you look back? In the index, there are 4 entries. Page 20, I'll give them to you right now. Pages 24, 25, page 59, page 60, page 61, and page 77. Sorry, there are 5 entries. We saw Diego Rivera last time. His murals in the Palacio Nacional in Mexico City of the indigenous groups. I was focusing on the ways in which he uses the codices, if you'll remember. And we saw the stripping of the bark tree, the amate tree, the stripping of the bark, rather, and so forth. So take another look at these passages on Rivera, since we've now seen a little bit of his work. I had intended to show you more, but all you have to do is click on, in the internet, on images under Google, and you'll find jillions of Rivera's, and many of you will know his work anyway. So he's a great, like the artesania that's being celebrated, he's the great chronicler of the community, of the people of Mexico, and he saw himself in that way. He saw himself as a tlacuilo. Remember the word that we heard last time, the poets who painted the codices. Okay, other comments or questions about all of this? Do you have passages? I started by asking that. I get the feeling not. Comments? If not, I'm going to let you go a little early and have a lovely Thanksgiving, and I will see you back here on Tuesday, and we will carry on. Let's look at our syllabus just to make sure we're all together.
Yes, I remember about Galianki, we needed to get 3 passages from each, and then kind of have a